Hey there, welcome back to Corporate Law 101, an entrepreneur's guide. We're now going to begin section 2, part 2 on shareholders. This is a very interesting group here now that we talk about. We're going to talk about what is a shareholder, who owns the shares. Well, the shareholders are the owners of the company, and a shareholder is any person, company, or other institution that owns at least one share of the company's stock. Because the shareholders are the company's owners, they reap the benefits of the company's successes in the form of increased stock valuation. However, if the company does poorly, shareholders can lose their money if the price of the stock declines. Unlike the owners of sole proprietorships or partnerships, corporate shareholders are not personally liable for the company's debts and other financial obligations, which, as we've said in the first tutorial, is the most important, is the protection of your personal assets from the corporate assets. This means that if a company goes under, its creditors cannot demand payment from shareholders like they could from the owners of a privately held entity. Okay? Now, again, we're going to talk about the corporate formalities. If you don't follow the corporate formalities, that what is called corporate veil that is given to you to protect you can be breached for wrongful acts. And wrongful acts are very interesting things because they talk about what are wrongful acts historically and what are wrongful acts as the courts are now looking at them is going to be discussed as part of our final tutorial on the corporate formalities piece of this. Though they are not involved in most decisions day to day because the shareholders elect a board of directors and the board of directors elects officers who actually run the company, their rights are defined by things like the corporation's charter, which you file with the Secretary of State, and the bylaws of the corporation, a very interesting process of rules set out for almost every major corporation. You want to make sure that you get a copy of those bylaws as part of your getting your stock certificate. Shareholders have the right to inspect the company's books and records and even sue the corporation for misdeeds of the directors and officers, for example, again, for some of these wrongful acts. These are things that the shareholders find that were done by the officers, directors, or otherwise of the corporation that are to the disadvantage or are wrongful acts against the shareholders. Common shareholders are also entitled to vote on major corporate matters, such as who sits on the board and whether the proposed merger should go through. Most importantly, in the event that the company liquidates its assets as a bankruptcy or dissolution, its shareholders have a right to a proportionate allocation of the proceeds. Secured creditors, bondholders, and of course preferred shareholders have precedence over common shareholders in any liquidation. Shareholders also have the right to receive portions of any dividends the company declares. Shareholders also have the right to attend corporate annual meetings to learn about the company's performance or listen to the meeting via conference call. Common shareholders who cannot or do not wish to attend a meeting to vote on a given matter have the right to vote by what is called a proxy. Proxy. And a proxy basically gives the right to vote the person's shares to another person. And this can work for both common and preferred shareholders. And it obviously depends on how the governance policies of the individual corporations are laid out. So how did somebody become a shareholder? Well, they gave money to the corporation. And when they gave money to the corporation, in return for part ownership, the corporation issues a certificate of ownership interest to the shareholder or stockholder. Shareholders, stockholders, they're both the same. These certificates are known as stock certificates, capital stock, or just stock, and represent the ownership of the company, as I said. Stock is the evidence of that ownership interest, and it is not a loan to the corporation. Stock does not come due or mature. The stockholder owns the stock until he or she decides to sell it. And remember, the sale of those shares can be controlled by a shareholder agreement between the parties, and if it is, then that controls how you can sell the stock and to whom you can sell the stock. A stockholder owns the stock until they decide to sell it to someone who wants to buy their stock, and they must find a buyer themselves, usually through the services of a stockbroker. Now, that is if they're publicly traded, there's stockbrokers who will handle it. If there are if it's a privately held corporation, smaller corporations, then you must find a buyer and have someone who basically introduces people who are interested in procuring stock from smaller companies. Nowhere on the stock certificate is it indicated what the stock is worth or what price was paid to acquire it. In the market of buyers or sellers, the current value of any stock fluctuates literally moment to moment. What makes Google worth $400 a share and Johnny Jones Company worth, 50 cents a share, if that, okay? Now, lastly, kind of in this particular area, before I go into these minority shareholder rights and things of that sort, I want to talk about a corporation's accounting records are involved here, because this is where the corporate records that I am talking about and the financial accounting records really kind of lay on top of one another and intersect. And the company records are involved when the corporation is the issuer, seller, or buyer of its own shares. And that's when we get into how many dollars were paid for it. We get into the things that we'll talk about on the stock ledger, and we'll talk about some of those items as well. Now, let's talk about the common rights of shareholders. They have the voting power on major issues. They have ownership in a portion of the company. They have the right to transfer their ownership, of course, as we said, subject to some shareholder agreements and things of that sort. They are entitled to dividends as they're issued by the company. So, well, gee, the company's automatically going to take the profit and issue it, aren't they? Whoa, Daddy. No, not necessarily. The company issues the dividends predicated on what the officers of the company and the board of directors who direct those officers believe is the fair amount of value of the company that can be distributed out as profits, if you will, called dividends here, okay, are available. Sometimes the company will withhold money that it could pay in dividends because it wants to be able to expand or it wants to be able to buy another company, and those decisions are made by management, not by the owners of the company per se, okay? They're made by the officers. Now, the shareholders elect the board elects the officers, so believe me, the big shareholders need to be involved in those decisions and help direct when those dividends are paid, etc. And remember, the IRS and all the courts look at, did you distribute these dividends? Because if you're not, then you're not a real corporation. You're not acting as a real corporation. The shareholders also have the opportunity to inspect corporate and business records, as we talked about. And this is going to be very important when we talk about keeping corporate records and the corporate ledger up to speed, and keeping all of your corporate documents in one spot, which we're going to talk about some of the tools to do that. And then, of course, they have the right, as we talked about earlier, to sue for wrongful actions and elect the board and provide the corporate formalities. The corporate formalities really begin the moment the board of directors is elected. These board of directors are called fiduciaries. A fiduciary has an obligation to protect the interests of the shareholders. Very important. So the board of directors are inexplicably linked to the board of directors and vice versa. These board of directors, he or she must do what is in the best interest of the shareholders, not in their own personal best interests. And the corporate formality requirements really begin at this point in time. So let's move to the next page. Here we see the shareholder table, which we saw earlier. We have, these are obviously made up names, but we have Jailhouse Fingers, and he has an address in various areas, and we've got his form, okay, and we have 3 or 4 other shareholders who then basically now are going to be shown on a stock table. Right now you'll see the Jailhouse Fingers Parker has 25,000 dilutable shares, but he also has 5,000 non-dilutable shares. That's very important. Nobody else has non-dilutable, so we're going to have to be careful throughout our operation on the non-dilutable shares owned by Mr. Parker. The total number of shares that he owns individually, the total amounts, the percentages of, remember, of issued versus authorized. Very important. We're going to talk about these percentages as we go to the stock table, but you'll see them here. This is where the ownership. So in this particular example, there's 100,000 authorized shares. We've currently issued 53,400, which represents approximately 53.40 of the total shares issued. That's a percentage of 78.76 of the issued shares goes to those folks out of the 100,000. Okay? So that basically now is a shareholder and what a shareholder does. So the shareholder gives money to the company. It's generally booked into the corporate documents in the stock table here, the number of shares. The money will be shown on the stock table in the stock ledger, which we'll get into next. So at this point in time, I think now this is a pretty good overview of shareholders, and we'll be back after these important messages. And thank you for taking the time on these shareholder information. And that's it for now for this tutorial. Copyright 2017, BrainTech CSI Inc., all rights reserved.